In this video, I want to talk about plant structures and their functions. Before I get into specific structures, I want to talk a little bit about plant tissues, because plants are multicellular organisms, and that means that their cells are organized into tissues or groups of cells that have a similar function. There's basically three types of tissue. There's vascular tissue, dermal tissue, and ground tissue. Vascular tissue we've already mentioned in talking about plant classification, and it's the long, thin tubes that are arranged in bundles for transporting materials and providing support to the plant. And we'll talk a little bit more about their structure in a couple slides. Dermal tissue is the protective outer coating or the skin of the plant. And different parts of the plants have specialized dermal cells, such as around the outside of the leaves. You have cuticle, which produce a waxy coating that helps keep water from getting away from the leaves too quickly, helps retain water. Guard cells on the bottom side of leaves let gases in and out for photosynthesis. And on roots, we have very tiny root hairs, very, very small projections that help absorb water and minerals. And then in between dermal and vascular tissue, you have ground tissue, and it basically fills in the space and holds the cells for the other functions. There's three different types, and you're not going to have to remember these names, but I do want to introduce them. Parenchyma is the most common type of ground tissue, and that's where we see most of our photosynthesis happening because those cells contain chloroplasts. And then we have collenchyma and sclerenchyma, which are more rigid types of ground tissue that help support the plant. Here's an illustration just showing in a very stylized way these three types of tissue. So our vascular tissue, the xylem and phloem, are found here in the center of this plant. This is the setup for a dicot plant. The xylem is more to kind of an X in the middle, and then phloem around the outside. And then the dermal tissue, or the epidermis, just the same word we use talking about our own skin, is found on the outside of the plant, and then in the middle, of course, is our ground tissue. So let's spend a few minutes on vascular tissue. Xylem is the name of the tissue that carries water, and it goes only one way. It goes from the roots upward. It doesn't travel in the downward direction, but only up. Xylem is actually made of dead cells to form tubes, so think of like a lot of long straws. Some of these tubes are narrow and some of them are wide, depending upon where they're found in the plant and what they're transporting. Then along with xylem, we have phloem, and this tissue carries nutrients up and down the plant. So this is going two ways, both up and down, depending upon the plant's needs. Phloem is where we find the carbohydrates that are produced by photosynthesis, the glucose, and then if it's combined together into more multi-chained molecules. And phloem itself is living, it is not dead cells, but they have holes on the end to allow the substances to pass from one cell to the next. Xylem and phloem are bundled together. I lost a verb there. I was supposed to say bundled. Obviously, I didn't proofread this well enough. They're bundled together in what's known as vascular bundles in plant stems and roots. And the way that these vascular bundles are arranged differs between monocots and dicots. We saw the dicot picture of a stem in the previous slide where all of the vascular tissue is in the center, whereas in monocot they are scattered throughout the stem. Here's an illustration of these two types of vascular tissue, xylem for carrying water. And you can see because these cells are dead, they've actually opened up. So it is like a straw going through from the roots to the leaves, to the farthest part of the plant. There are both these wider tubes known as elements and the smaller tubes known as tracheids to carry water in xylem. In phloem, because the cells are still living, they are intact all the way around, so they haven't lost one end of them. But there are openings in the top and the bottom of these cells so that substances can pass through. And even though phloem is carrying, we talk about them carrying food and carrying carbohydrates, those substances, of course, are dissolved in water so that it is able to flow. In general, the plant is divided into two main sections. Everything under the ground is the root system, and everything above the ground is the shoot system. To be a little more specific on the shoot side of things, we have the stem and the leaf, and then, of course, a flower for reproduction and a fruit, perhaps, that's being produced after reproduction to protect the seed. So let's just talk about each of those sections. The roots are involved in anchoring the plant to the soil, and absorbing water and minerals that are also found in the soil. Roots themselves can be arranged in several different ways. We can categorize them broadly as having a taproot or a fibrous system, and we have an illustration over here. You can see that the taproot has the potential at least to go down much deeper for water. It also often is wide because it's storing carbohydrates inside. So this looks like a parsnip, which is something similar to a carrot. And so if we have a carrot, you are actually eating the root, and the root is a taproot structure. Fibrous style roots capture more surface water because they're broader in many more directions, but they don't go as deep, and they also are not necessarily a storage place for carbohydrates. When roots grow, they grow from the tip, so they'll grow downward from the tip. And then, of course, with these ones doing storage, they're going to grow outward from the center, so they can get wider. Roots actually have specialized cells in the root tips, which help detect gravity so that the plant knows which way is down. Stems hold the plants up. So roots hold them to the ground, plants hold them upright because you need to have light and a source of air or the carbon dioxide in the air to undergo photosynthesis. Stems also provide support for leaves and flowers or possibly cones or smaller stems. And stems' job is to transport water and nutrients around the plant. In some situations, the stem may also be a storage place for food or water. Plants may be specially adapted to store food or water, especially if they live in harsh conditions such as dry or cold climates. Stems grow from the tips and at the nodes, which is where the new, smaller stems come off. And stems also get thicker by growing at the outer edges. So you think about a tree trunk, you can count the rings of the tree. Each year the trunk gets wider because it's adding another layer on the outside. This happens to all kinds of stems in general. Leaves, of course, are essential for collecting sunlight, which allows the plant to make its own food by photosynthesis. And I'm sure you realize that leaves come in varying sizes, shape, and position on the stem of the plant. Here are some illustrations that show some of the different shapes that leaves come in. These different arrangements of leaves are designed to maximize the light exposure for that particular plant in its particular environment, while at the same time conserving water and reducing the resistance to the wind or optimizing the temperature around the plant. Leaves themselves contain several different types of specialized tissue that all work together for photosynthesis, and we'll look at leaves a little more detailed when we get to the photosynthesis unit. Flowers are the reproductive center of a flowering plant, and there are both male reproductive organs and female reproductive organs. The word for the male reproductive organ is the stamen, and it has separate parts of an anther where we find the pollen, which is then hanging, or it's positioned on top of the filament, which is basically a stalk. The female reproductive organ's name is the carpel, which consists of a stigma on top, which is kind of sticky to collect the pollen, and then the stalk is called a style, which goes down to the ovary where the eggs can be found. Petals on flowers are there to attract insects or other organisms which help with pollinizing and fertilizing the plant. Some plants are self-fertile, where they have both male and female reproductive parts in a flower and can fertilize themselves without help from any other organism. Whereas other plants may only have male or female flowers on that plant, or the male and female flowers are separate. Most plants must be fertilized by another plant of the same species. We call that cross-fertilization. There are only a few that will undergo self-fertilization. Here's an illustration of a flower that has both male and female parts to just show you how it works. And so the male reproductive parts, the stamen, the anther where the pollen is made, and the filament holding it up. And then the female reproductive parts being consistent of the sticky stigma on top, the style reaching down to the ovary where we could see the immature egg, the ovule, which is not fertilized yet, waiting in the ovary. Underneath a flower, you have the receptacle, which is basically holding that flower. And then, of course, some of the other parts here, petals, which can be brightly colored, and then the sepal, which protects the flower before it blooms. We talk about how all plants do alternation of generation, and this gives an illustration of that for flowering plants. It's very similar for conifers. And so the haploid cells are shown here in blue and the diploid in pink. So we see at the moment of fertilization, we have pollen being produced on the anther, which will land on the top of the stigma. And the pollen grain itself is multicellular, and it is our male gametophyte. So it's very, very small. It contains the sperm, but also other cells. And the sperm is made in the pollen grain, so that's our male gametophyte. The sperm will create and then swim down a pollen tube, looking for the ovule at the bottom, the egg. The ovule is made inside the ovary of the plant, and so the combination of cells that make up the ovule and the cells that support it are the female gametophyte. So again, in flowering plants and in conifers, these two gametophyte, the male and female gametophytes, are very, very small, and so we don't really pay any attention to them as separate generations of that organism, though they are haploid and they are that gametophyte generation. After fertilization occurs, then of course we've got our diploid generation. First the zygote, the fertilized cell, which then will create a plant embryo and house it inside the seed for flowering plants. And in this case, the seed is going to develop inside a fruit. When the seed germinates, the plant that grows from it is a sporophyte plant. It does have diploid chromosome number, and at the inside the reproductive organs of that sporophyte plant will that male gametophyte and female gametophyte develop and do the alternation of generations. And finally, I just want to mention that plant growth and how plants go through their life cycle are controlled by hormones. Plants release hormones, which are chemical messengers from one cell to another, in response to certain stimuli from the environment, and then the plant changes its behavior in response to what the hormone is doing inside cells. So hormones control plant growth and both speed and direction of plant growth, and promote events such as flowering or fruit development. There are basically 5 big categories of plant hormones, with many specific hormones within these categories. The category of auxins are hormones that are responsible for much of plant growth, especially at the apex or the tip of the stem, and when a plant bends towards or away from a stimulus. When a plant bends, it's known as trophism. So if it's bending towards light, it's phototrophism. Or when a plant is curling around a stem here, we've got, again, another type of tropism that's dependent on touch. Ethylene is a hormone, it's also a gas, that is released as fruits ripen. So this is why if you have one ripe fruit or one overripe fruit, you can have other fruits in the same area also ripen a little bit too much. Gibberellins are a type of hormone that promotes the growth of seeds and of buds that then would turn into flowers. Cytokinins encourage cell division throughout the plant, so not just on the apex of the stem. And abscisic acid helps a plant maintain its dormancy, which is important in cold climates where plants need to be dormant through the winter. So that covers this overview of plant structures and some of their important functions in helping plants survive and thrive in the world around us.